I remember the day I first saw the apartment. The landlord, a man in his late 50s with a face weathered by time and secrets, handed me the keys with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The building was old, too old perhaps, with its cracked walls and peeling wallpaper, but the rent was cheap, and I needed a place to start over. As I walked through the door, a chill ran down my spine, though the air inside was warm, almost stifling. The apartment was furnished in a way that suggested it had seen many tenants come and go, each leaving behind traces of their presence, a faint perfume lingering in the air, a forgotten book on a dusty shelf, and an unsettling sense of abandonment. From the moment I set foot inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't something I could see, but a presence that seemed to linger in the corners, just out of sight. The apartment was mostly quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, which groaned under the weight of footsteps that weren't mine. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old place with old bones, but deep down, I knew there was something more, something that lurked in the shadows. As I explored the apartment, I noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, heavier, with a lock that seemed newer, out of place in this time-worn building. When I tried to open it, I found it securely locked. The handle didn't budge, not even a little. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing down the empty hall, but there was no response. Only the silence that followed, pressing in on me from all sides. I asked the landlord about the locked room, hoping for a simple explanation. He paused, his gaze flickering to the door and then back to me. "That room stays locked," he said, his voice firm but devoid of emotion. I pressed him further, but he only repeated the same phrase. "It stays locked." As if those 3 words were enough to explain everything. His demeanor changed, becoming more distant, almost as if a wall had gone up between us. I didn't push anymore, sensing that any attempt to pry would be met with cold resistance. But as I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back, watching me leave with a look I couldn't quite decipher. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the apartment. Pipes groaning, the distant hum of the city outside. But it was the silence from the hallway that unnerved me the most. It was too quiet, as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something. My thoughts kept drifting back to the locked room, to the way the landlord had avoided my questions. What was behind that door? Why was it locked so tightly? And why did it feel like it was calling to me, whispering my name in the dead of night? I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being irrational. But the sense of unease grew stronger with each passing hour. I could feel it, like a cold hand pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to shake it off, to focus on other things. But the thought of that locked door gnawed at my mind, a dark seed of curiosity that I couldn't uproot. The first night passed without incident, but sleep didn't come easy. My dreams were plagued by shadowy figures and whispers that I couldn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, the room around me dark and oppressive, the air thick with an unseen presence. I sat up, my heart racing, and for a moment I thought I heard something. Soft, almost imperceptible, a sound like a distant whisper coming from the hallway. I listened, holding my breath, but it faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me in silence once more. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, its walls pulsating with an energy that I couldn't explain. Every creak, every groan, every flicker of the lights felt deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. The locked door became an obsession, a dark mystery that filled my every waking thought. I found myself standing in front of it more often, staring at the cold, unyielding surface, feeling the weight of whatever was on the other side pressing against it, straining to be free. Each night, the dreams grew worse, more vivid, more terrifying. The shadows in my dreams began to take shape, forming into figures with faces that I couldn't quite make out, but whose presence filled me with a primal fear. I would wake up gasping for breath. The sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And always, in the back of my mind, I could hear it. The soft, insistent whisper coming from the direction of the locked room. The terror crept into my waking life. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that disappeared when I turned to look, reflections in the mirrors that didn't match my own movements. The apartment, once just a place to live, had become a maze of fear and uncertainty, with the locked door at its center, a gateway to something I was too afraid to confront. But I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. The mystery of the locked room was like a splinter in my mind, a dark enigma that demanded to be solved. And as much as I feared what I might find, I knew that one day I would have to open that door, to face whatever horror lay hidden behind it. It started with the small things, the kind of details that you wouldn't normally notice unless you were already on edge. The first time it happened, I was sure it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I had left my keys on the kitchen counter before going to bed, only to find them the next morning on the table in the living room. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I must have moved them without realizing it, but the unease in my gut suggested otherwise. The following day, the same thing happened with a book I had been reading. I distinctly remembered placing it on my bedside table before turning off the light. Yet the next morning it was on the floor near the door, as if someone, or something, had moved it while I slept. The pattern continued, with objects subtly shifting from their original positions. A chair slightly turned, a picture frame askew, the television remote placed somewhere I never remembered putting it. These were small, almost insignificant changes, but they began to add up, each one chipping away at my sense of security. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. The logical part of my mind insisted that there had to be a rational explanation, but the growing pit of dread in my stomach told a different story. Then there were the sounds, soft, barely perceptible noises that seemed to come from nowhere. At night, I would lie in bed, straining to listen, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling. But these sounds were different, too deliberate to be ignored. There were footsteps, faint but unmistakable, pacing slowly up and down the hallway outside my bedroom door. I would hold my breath, waiting for them to stop, but they never did. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they would cease, leaving only silence in their wake. I would lie there for hours, my body tense, expecting the footsteps to start again, but they never did. At least, not until the next night. The whispers were the worst. They began as faint murmurs, like distant voices carried on the wind, too far away to make out any words. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to echo through the apartment. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, and laced with a terror that sent chills down my spine. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the whispers still ringing in my ears. They were coming from the hallway, right outside the locked door. The dreams, too, began to change, becoming darker, more vivid. In them, I would find myself standing in front of the locked door, my hand reaching out to the handle. I would hesitate, a voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn away. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. As soon as my hand touched the handle, the door would swing open on its own, revealing a darkness so deep, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the light around it. And from that darkness, something would emerge, something formless, yet filled with an overwhelming sense of malevolence. I could never see it clearly, but I could feel it, its presence heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I would wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, the terror from the dream clinging to me like a second skin. As the days wore on, my reality began to blur with the nightmares. I would find myself staring at the locked door, unable to look away, the whispers growing louder in my mind. I became obsessed with the idea of what could be inside, my thoughts consumed by the possibilities. Could it be a person? Something else? Each theory I concocted was more terrifying than the last, but none of them provided any comfort. The door had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the apartment, a mystery that I could no longer ignore. But the more I thought about it, the more my paranoia grew. I started noticing other things, subtle at first, but impossible to dismiss. Shadows that didn't belong, moving just out of sight. Reflections in the windows that didn't match what was behind me. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, watching me, waiting for something. The feeling of being observed was no longer confined to the corners of my vision. It was everywhere, a constant presence that followed me from room to room. I began avoiding the hallway altogether, the sense of dread becoming too much to bear. But even in other parts of the apartment, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was never truly alone. The whispers would find me, no matter where I went, their voices growing louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn me of something. But what? I didn't know, and the not knowing was driving me mad. The worst part was that I had no one to talk to about it. The landlord had made it clear that he wasn't interested in discussing the room, and I had no friends or family in the area. I was alone, trapped in an apartment that seemed to be conspiring against me. Every day, the fear grew stronger, feeding on itself, until I was no longer sure what was real and what was in my head. The only constant was the door, that damn locked door, which had become the focal point of my every fear and anxiety. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faintest of sounds, like a door creaking open. My heart raced as I strained to listen, my body frozen in place. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers were louder than ever, almost a scream now, but I couldn't make out the words. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the door of my bedroom, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened the door, the hallway was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight streaming through a window at the far end. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The locked door, my locked door, was open, just a crack, but enough to reveal a darkness beyond that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The whispers grew to a crescendo, filling my head with a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the door, at the blackness that seemed to be beckoning me closer. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The door was closed again, the whispers gone, leaving only silence behind. I stood there, my body trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it another dream? Or was the apartment playing some kind of cruel game with me, drawing me deeper into its mystery, into its madness? I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The locked door had become an obsession, a puzzle that I was compelled to solve, no matter the cost. But every time I approached it, I was filled with a terror so profound, so all-consuming, that I couldn't bring myself to reach out and open it. The door was a threshold, a barrier between the known and the unknown, and I wasn't sure I was ready to cross it. But I knew that sooner or later, I would have to. The door was waiting for me, and whatever was behind it was growing more impatient with each passing day. The days turned into a blur of anxiety and fear, with the locked door becoming a constant looming presence in my mind. I felt as though I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, with one part of me desperate to understand the mystery and another terrified of what I might find. The whispers that had once been a distant murmur were now an incessant, maddening chorus that seemed to echo through my skull, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were thoughts, ideas that crept into my mind unbidden, twisting my perception of reality and filling me with a sense of dread so intense that it was suffocating. I began to withdraw from the world around me. My life outside the apartment started to fade into the background, as if it no longer mattered. I stopped going to work, stopped answering phone calls, and distanced myself from the few friends I had left. Every interaction felt like a distraction, a pointless interruption in my obsessive need to unravel the enigma that had consumed my life. The apartment became my entire world, a claustrophobic labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. With the locked door at its center, a black hole that was slowly pulling me in. As I spent more time alone, the isolation only heightened my paranoia. I started to doubt everything, my memories, my perceptions, even my sanity. Were the whispers real, or were they just a product of my deteriorating mind? Was I truly seeing the shadows that flickered just beyond my sight? Or was it all in my head? The apartment seemed to warp around me, its walls closing in, as if it was alive and feeding off my fear. The once familiar rooms became alien, hostile, filled with a malevolent energy that I couldn't explain. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights felt deliberate, a part of some dark conspiracy that I was only just beginning to understand. I started to see connections where none should have existed. The landlord's evasive answers, the strange looks from my neighbors, even the objects that moved on their own. All of it seemed to be part of a larger, more sinister puzzle. I found myself scouring the apartment for clues, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. I checked the walls for hidden messages, the floors for secret compartments, the windows for signs of someone watching from outside. But every search ended in frustration, with no answers, only more questions. The more I searched, the more I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen the door open that night, or had it all been a dream? Was the fear I felt justified, or was I succumbing to some kind of madness? The whispers grew louder, more demanding, as if they were trying to tell me something crucial, something I couldn't afford to ignore. But their words were jumbled, incoherent, and the more I tried to make sense of them, the more they slipped through my grasp, like sand through my fingers. I started to lose track of time. Days bled into nights, and I found myself drifting in and out of a waking nightmare, unable to tell where one ended and the other began. Sleep was no longer a refuge. It was a battleground, where my dreams were invaded by the same dark presence that haunted me while I was awake. I would dream of the locked door, standing before it as the shadows behind it twisted and writhed, taking on forms that were too horrifying to comprehend. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, with the whispers still ringing in my ears. And always, the door was there, waiting, watching, its secrets locked away behind a barrier I was too afraid to cross. The apartment began to change in more tangible ways, too. The temperature fluctuated wildly from freezing cold to stifling heat, often in the span of minutes. The lights would flicker at odd times, plunging me into darkness just as I was about to enter a room or reach for something important. Strange smells wafted through the air, sulfur, decay, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. I would hear faint scratching sounds, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls, or footsteps pacing in the rooms above, even though I knew the apartment above mine was empty. These phenomena were subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but they became more pronounced, more frequent, until they were impossible to ignore. The landlord's behavior became more unsettling as well. When I managed to confront him again about the door, his response was even more evasive, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid of being overheard. He seemed nervous, agitated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. His refusal to answer my questions only fueled my paranoia, convincing me that there was some terrible secret being kept from me, something that tied him, the apartment, and the locked door together in a web of deceit and horror. It wasn't long before I started to question my own reflection. I would catch glimpses of myself in the mirror, but something about the image staring back at me felt wrong. My eyes seemed darker, sunken, as if something was slowly draining the life out of me. My skin had taken on a pallor, my hair seemed thinner, more brittle. There were moments when my reflection didn't seem to move in sync with me. A split-second delay that left me frozen in place, staring at the mirror, waiting for the discrepancy to appear again. I started covering up the mirrors, but it didn't help. I could still feel that other version of myself watching, waiting for the right moment to step out of the glass and take my place. The whispers continued to torment me, now accompanied by flashes of images, disjointed, horrifying scenes that would appear in my mind without warning. A dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, eyes glowing with a sinister light. A hand, skeletal and decayed, reaching out from the darkness. A face twisted in agony, screaming silently as its features melted away into nothingness. These visions were more than just nightmares. They felt like memories, as if I was recalling something I had seen before, something that had been buried deep in my subconscious. But whose memories were they? Mine? Or someone? Or something else's? The isolation, the whispers, the visions. It was all becoming too much to bear. My mind was a labyrinth of fear and confusion, with no clear way out. I had become a prisoner in my own home, trapped by my own fear, by the mystery of the locked door, by the darkness that was slowly consuming me from within. I knew I was spiraling, losing touch with reality, but there was no one I could turn to for help. I was alone, utterly and completely, with nothing but the whispers and the shadows for company. And yet, despite all of this, I couldn't shake the compulsion to open the door. It was as if the door itself was calling to me, whispering my name in the dead of night, urging me to uncover its secrets. But I knew that whatever was behind that door wasn't just a room. It was a portal, a gateway to something far darker, something that had been waiting for me all along. The door was no longer just a mystery to be solved. It was a test, a challenge, a confrontation with the darkness within myself. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face it, but I knew that sooner or later I would have no choice. The darkness was growing stronger, more insistent, and the only way to escape it was to confront it head-on, to open the door and face whatever horrors lay in wait on the other side. The descent into madness was not sudden. It was a slow, agonizing process that chipped away at my sanity, piece by piece, until I could no longer distinguish between reality and the dark fantasies that plagued my mind. Every day felt like a struggle to keep my head above water. But the more I fought, the deeper I sank into the abyss. The apartment, once a place of refuge, had transformed into a living nightmare, its walls closing in around me, suffocating me with their oppressive silence. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were commands, thoughts that burrowed into my brain and took root, warping my perception until I could no longer trust my own senses. The line between the real world and the nightmare I was living began to blur. I would wake up in the middle of the night, unsure if the horrors I had just experienced were dreams or if they had actually happened. Shadows moved of their own accord, creeping along the walls like living entities. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my field of vision, never left me. It clung to me, a constant, suffocating presence that made my skin crawl. I stopped leaving the apartment altogether. The outside world felt distant, unreal, like a memory from a past life. My days were spent in a haze of paranoia and dread, each hour bleeding into the next, with no distinction between day and night. The apartment was always dim, the lights flickering on and off at random intervals, as if the building itself was alive, feeding off the fear that consumed me. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a stench that seemed to emanate from the very walls, growing stronger with each passing day. I tried to find the source, tearing through the apartment in a frenzy, but there was nothing. No dead animal, no rotting food, just the pervasive, sickening odor that clung to everything. The locked door was no longer just a door. It had become an obsession, a black hole that drew me closer and closer with each passing day. The whispers, once faint and distant, were now a constant presence in my mind, urging me to open the door, to confront whatever lay behind it. But the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing me whenever I even considered reaching for the handle. I would stand in the hallway, staring at the door, my hand trembling as I fought the compulsion to turn the knob. But I never could. something always held me back. A deep, primal instinct that warned me of the horrors that awaited on the other side. My dreams became indistinguishable from reality. I would dream of the door opening on its own, of a figure standing in the darkness beyond, watching me with eyes that burned with a malevolent light. The figure would step forward, its form shifting and changing, becoming something monstrous, something that defied all logic and reason. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, only to find that the darkness was still there, pressing in on me from all sides, as if the nightmare had followed me into the waking world. I could no longer tell if I was awake or still trapped in the dream. The terror so real, so palpable, that it consumed me completely. The apartment itself seemed to change, warping and twisting around me, as if it were alive. The walls would seem to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with my own ragged breaths. The floor would shift beneath my feet as if something was moving just below the surface, something that was trying to break through. The windows, once a source of light and hope, were now blackened, as if covered by a thick layer of grime that I could never wipe away. No matter how hard I tried, the darkness outside remained impenetrable, cutting me off from the world beyond. The few times I dared to glance in the mirror, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. My reflection had become a twisted parody of myself, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink deeper into my skull with each passing day. My skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over my bones, and my hair, once thick and full, had become thin and lifeless, hanging limply around my face. But it was the eyes that terrified me the most, dark, sunken, and filled with a deep, abiding fear that mirrored the terror in my own heart. It was as if the person in the mirror was not me, but something else, something that had taken my place and was slowly consuming me from the inside out. The whispers began to take on a new, more sinister tone. They no longer just urged me to open the door, they demanded it, their voices growing louder and more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They promised answers, an end to the torment, but there was an undercurrent of malice in their words, a dark threat that I couldn't ignore. They would not be denied, and the longer I resisted, the more they would punish me. The whispers became shouts, angry, vicious, echoing through my mind until I could no longer think, no longer breathe, no longer function. The shadows in the apartment grew bolder, no longer content to stay just out of sight. I would see them slithering along the walls, creeping across the floor, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that defied all logic and reason. They would dart toward me, only to disappear just before they reached me, leaving me trembling in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel them brushing against my skin, cold and clammy, leaving a trail of ice in their wake. I would lash out, trying to swat them away, but my hands would pass through them as if they were made of smoke, leaving me to wonder if they were real or just another figment of my unraveling mind. There were times when I would find myself standing in front of the locked door, my hand outstretched, the whispers screaming in my head to open it, to let them in. But I couldn't. The fear was too great, too overwhelming. I would stand there for hours, paralyzed by terror, until finally something would snap me out of it, a loud noise, a sudden movement, and I would stumble back, retreating to the relative safety of my bedroom, my heart racing, my body drenched in cold sweat. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It had become a prison, a labyrinth of horrors that I could not escape. The locked door was at its center, a dark pulsating heart that held the key to my salvation, or my destruction. The longer I stayed, the more the apartment seemed to warp around me, twisting and changing in ways that defied all logic and reason. The walls would shift, the floor would buckle, and the shadows would grow longer, darker, until they consumed everything in their path. And through it all, the whispers would grow louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear, all I could think about. The nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as the whispers filled my mind, telling me of the horrors that awaited me behind the locked door. I would see the shadows moving in the corners of my room, creeping closer and closer, until they were right beside me, their cold breath on my skin. I would hear the door creak open in the hallway, the soft thud of footsteps approaching my bedroom. But I was too terrified to move, too paralyzed to even scream. I could only lie there, waiting for the nightmare to end, knowing that it never would. The apartment had become a living entity, a malevolent force that was slowly but surely driving me to the brink of madness. The locked door was its core, its source of power, and I was trapped in its grasp, unable to escape, unable to fight back. The whispers, the shadows, the nightmares, they were all part of its plan, a carefully orchestrated descent into madness that I could not resist. And the worst part was that I knew deep down that there was no escape. The apartment had claimed me, and it would not let me go until I had opened that door, until I had faced the horrors that awaited me on the other side. But I was too afraid. The fear had taken hold of me, sinking its claws deep into my mind, and I could not break free. The door remained locked, the mystery unsolved, the darkness within me growing stronger with each passing day. The apartment was winning, and I was losing myself, piece by piece, to the terror that had consumed my life. And still, the whispers called to me, louder and louder, until they were all I could hear, all I could think about, all I could dream of. The door was waiting, and I knew that eventually I would have no choice but to open it. The apartment would see to that. The longer I stayed in the apartment, the more I realized that the mystery of the locked door wasn't just a puzzle to be solved. It was a living enigma, a riddle that clawed at my mind, refusing to let go. The whispers that had once been an unsettling background noise were now a relentless, ceaseless barrage of voices that filled my thoughts day and night. They were no longer just urging me to open the door. They were begging, pleading, as if their very existence depended on it. The desperation in their voices was palpable, and it mirrored the growing desperation within me. I needed to know what was behind that door, even if the truth destroyed me. But every time I steeled myself to face the mystery, something would happen to throw me off balance, to push me deeper into the abyss of doubt and fear. It was as if the apartment itself was conspiring to keep me in a state of perpetual uncertainty, dangling the answers just out of reach, taunting me with glimpses of the truth that were never quite enough to grasp. The door had become the focal point of my existence, the axis around which my entire world now revolved. But the closer I got to unlocking its secrets, the more the apartment seemed to resist, twisting reality around me in ways that defied explanation. I began to notice patterns in the madness, small details that seemed to repeat themselves, as if the apartment was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something through the chaos. The flickering lights would pulse in time with the whispers, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. The temperature in the apartment would drop suddenly, leaving my breath visible in the air, only to spike moments later, suffocating me with an intense, oppressive heat. These fluctuations seemed to correspond with my proximity to the door, as if the apartment was warning me, or perhaps daring me, to take that final step and confront the horror that lay in wait. The symbols began to appear shortly after. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, odd markings that would appear on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, only to disappear when I looked directly at them. But as the days passed, they became more pronounced, more intricate, as if they were being burned into the very fabric of the apartment itself. They resembled nothing I had ever seen before, twisting, angular lines that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, forming patterns that made no sense, yet filled me with a deep, abiding terror. I tried to trace them, to make sense of their meaning, but the more I looked, the more the minus kommer månden to more shift and change before my eyes, as if they were alive, like responding to my presence. It wasn't just the symbols either. Objects in the apartment began to take on a life of their own, moving in ways that defied all logic. I would place something on a table, only to find it in a completely different room minutes later, as if it had walked there on its own. The furniture would creak and groan as if something unseen was shifting it around, trying to send me a message that I couldn't decipher. The walls would bend and warp when I wasn't looking, only to snap back into place when I turned to face them, leaving me questioning whether I had truly seen the move, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The whispers grew more frantic with each passing day, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that I could no longer ignore. They spoke of things I couldn't understand, in languages I had never heard, yet somehow their meaning was clear. They were trapped, imprisoned behind the door, and they needed me to set them free. But there was something else in their voices, something dark and dangerous, a warning that I couldn't quite grasp. They were desperate for release, but there was a hint of fear in their pleas, as if they were just as afraid of what lay behind the door as I was. I found myself drawn to the door more and more frequently, unable to resist its pull. I would stand there for hours, my hand hovering over the handle, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. The symbols on the door had grown more intricate, more threatening, as if they were warding me off, trying to protect me from what lay inside. But the whispers pushed me forward, urging me to ignore the warnings, to break the seal and discover the truth, no matter the cost. The tension between the two forces was unbearable, tearing me apart as I stood there, frozen in place, unable to move forward, yet unable to turn away. The few times I did manage to tear myself away from the door, I found that the apartment had changed in my absence. The layout seemed different, the room shifting subtly, as if the building itself was alive and trying to confuse me, to keep me from finding my way back. I would walk through a doorway expecting to enter the living room, only to find myself in the kitchen or the bathroom, disoriented and terrified. The walls would stretch and contract, the hallways growing longer and more twisted, turning the apartment into a maze that I could no longer navigate. I felt as though I was being hunted, pursued by something I couldn't see, something that lurked just beyond the edge of my vision, always one step behind. The dreams became worse, more vivid, more terrifying. I would find myself in front of the door, my hand on the handle, the whispers screaming in my ears, urging me to open it. But when I did, the door would lead, not to a room, but to a vast, dark void, a nothingness that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with the echoes of the whispers, now a cacophony of screams. I would step into the void, falling endlessly, the darkness swallowing me whole, until I woke up gasping for air, the terror of the dream clinging to me like a second skin. The line between the dreams and reality had blurred to the point where I could no longer tell them apart, and I began to fear that one day I wouldn't wake up at all, that the void would claim me for good. The landlord became a figure of dread in my mind. His evasiveness, his refusal to answer my questions, had taken on a new, sinister significance. I began to suspect that he knew more than he was letting on, that he was somehow involved in the nightmare I was living. I would hear his footsteps outside my door late at night, the soft creak of the floorboards as he moved through the hallway. I would rush to the door, hoping to confront him, to demand answers. But when I opened it, the hallway would be empty, the apartment silent once more. But I knew he had been there. I could feel his presence, a cold, oppressive weight that lingered in the air long after he had gone. In my desperation, I began to search for any clues, any scrap of information that might explain what was happening. I scoured the apartment, looking for hidden compartments, for messages scrawled in the margins of old books, for anything that might shed light on the enigma of the locked door. But every search ended in frustration, with nothing to show for my efforts except the growing sense that I was being toyed with, that the apartment was leading me in circles, keeping me trapped in its web of madness. As the days wore on, I became increasingly convinced that the only way to escape the nightmare was to open the door, to confront whatever horror lay behind it. But the fear was overwhelming, a physical force that kept me paralyzed whenever I tried to take that final step. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were thoughts, invading my mind, filling it with images of what might be waiting for me on the other side. I saw visions of unspeakable horrors, of creatures that defied all logic and reason, of darkness so absolute that it seemed to consume everything it touched. But I also saw something else, glimpses of the truth, of a secret so terrible that it had been locked away for a reason, a truth that I was not meant to know. The tension became unbearable, a constant gnawing pain that filled every waking moment. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but the door and the mystery that lay behind it. The apartment had become a prison, the door its gatekeeper, and I was the prisoner, trapped in a cycle of fear and desperation that had no end. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, growing more complex, more threatening, as if they were trying to hold something back, something that was pushing against them with a force that could not be contained. And then, one night, the decision was made for me. I was standing in front of the door, as I had so many times before, my hand hovering over the handle, the whispers screaming in my mind. The symbols on the door were glowing now, a sickly, pulsating light that filled the hallway with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel the walls closing in around me, the apartment itself trying to force me into action. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I fought against the terror that gripped me. And then suddenly the door opened on its own. The handle turned with a soft click, and the door swung inward, revealing the darkness beyond. The whispers fell silent, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and echoing in my ears. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was something in it, something that moved, shifting and writhing just out of sight. I could feel it, its presence pressing against me, filling the air with a sense of dread so intense that it was almost suffocating. I knew then that there was no going back. The door was open, and the truth was waiting for me, just beyond the threshold. But the fear was still there, a cold, icy grip that held me in place, keeping me from taking that final step. I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for me on the other side. But deep down, I knew that the only way to escape the nightmare was to face it, to step through the door and confront the horror that lay within. The whispers were gone, the apartment silent, as if it too was waiting, holding its breath, for me to make my choice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and then, with one final, trembling step, I crossed the threshold and entered the darkness. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click, sealing me inside, and the darkness swallowed me whole. As the door closed behind me with an ominous click, I was engulfed by the darkness. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, thick, oppressive, almost tangible, as if it were a living entity that had been waiting for me all along. The air was heavy, suffocating, carrying a stench of decay, and something else, something ancient and foul, like the breath of a beast that had been lurking in the shadows for centuries. My senses were overwhelmed, my mind racing with fear, yet there was no turning back. I'd crossed the threshold, and now there was only one way forward. The silence was deafening, a void where sound should have been, and it pressed against my ears, creating a ringing that grew louder with each passing moment. I reached out blindly, searching for something to hold on to, but my hands found only empty space. It was as if the room, or whatever this place was, had no walls, no floor, no ceiling. It was a vast, endless void, stretching out in all directions, with no discernible features, nothing to anchor me to reality. I was floating, lost in a sea of darkness, with no sense of direction, no way to escape. But then, the darkness began to move. At first it was subtle, a barely perceptible shift, like a shadow passing just beyond the edge of my vision. But as my eyes struggled to adjust, I realized that the darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was alive, writhing and shifting as if it were made up of countless tendrils, twisting and intertwining in a chaotic dance. Shapes began to emerge from the blackness, indistinct and formless, their outlines constantly shifting, as if they were struggling to take shape, but couldn't quite manage it. They moved with a purpose, converging on me from all directions, surrounding me, their presence growing stronger, more oppressive with each passing second. And then, the whispers returned, but they were different now. No longer the distant, disembodied voices that had haunted me for so long. They were clear, distinct, and they came from the shadows themselves. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their words harsh and guttural, filled with anger, pain, and something else. Something that made my blood run cold. It was as if they were cursing me, condemning me for something I couldn't remember, something I had done or failed to do. The voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of sound that threatened to tear my mind apart. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but there was no escape. They were inside my head, inside my very soul, and they wouldn't let me go. As the whispers grew louder, more frantic, the shapes in the darkness began to solidify, taking on more defined forms. I could see them now, twisted, grotesque figures, their bodies contorted in ways that defied all logic and reason. Their faces were a nightmare of hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Their skin stretched tight over skeletal frames, as if they were caught in a perpetual state of decay. They reached out to me with clawed hands, their fingers elongated and sharp, dripping with a dark, viscous liquid that glistened in the faint, sickly light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. One of the figures moved closer, its face inches from mine, and I could see the depth of its eyes, or rather, the lack of them. They were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to draw in the light, the very essence of life. And, as I stared into them, I felt my own strength being pulled away, drained into the void that was this creature. It opened its mouth, wider and wider, until it seemed it would swallow me whole, and from that abyss came a scream so filled with agony and despair that it shook me to my core. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a wave of pure, unfiltered terror that washed over me, threatening to drown me in its depths. In that moment, I knew the truth. These weren't just figments of my imagination, not mere hallucinations brought on by fear and isolation. They were real, beings that had been trapped here, in this place, for longer than I could comprehend. They had been waiting, biding their time, and now that the door was open, they were free. But their freedom came at a cost that they were all too eager to exact from me. The figures began to circle me, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the moment, relishing the fear that radiated from me in waves. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, their fingers brushing against me, leaving trails of ice in their wake. My body was paralyzed with terror, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go, no way out. I was trapped, surrounded on all sides by the darkness, by the creatures that had emerged from it, and I knew that there was no escape. The whispers became a roar, the voices merging into one, a single powerful entity that filled the void with its presence. It spoke directly to me now, its words clear and undeniable, echoing through the darkness with a force that shook me to my very core. It told me of the horrors that awaited me, the pain and suffering that I would endure, the price that I would pay for my curiosity, for my weakness. It was a voice of pure malice, of hatred that had been festering for centuries, and it spoke of a fate worse than death. As the voice spoke, the figures drew closer, their hands reaching out to me, their fingers wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me down into the darkness. I struggled, fought with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was futile. They were too strong, and I was too weak, too broken by the fear that had consumed me. I could feel the cold, clammy hands dragging me down, their grip like iron, unyielding, as they pulled me into the void. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed whole, a light appeared. It was faint at first, just a glimmer in the distance, but it grew brighter, stronger, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The figures recoiled from it, their screams of rage and pain filling the void as they were driven back, their forms dissolving into the shadows from which they had come. The light washed over me, warm and soothing, pushing back the darkness, the voices, the fear. But as the light enveloped me, I realized that it wasn't a light of salvation. It was something else, something far more terrifying. The warmth that it brought was suffocating, the brightness blinding, and I could feel it burning into my skin, searing through my flesh. The light was alive, a force of pure, overwhelming power, and it was consuming me, devouring me from the inside out. I screamed, but no sound came out. My voice was lost in the void, drowned out by the roar of the light, by the voices that still echoed in my mind. I could feel my body disintegrating, my very essence being torn apart by the light, by the power that it held. The darkness had been terrifying, but this was something far worse. It was annihilation, the complete and utter destruction of everything I was, everything I had been. And as the light consumed me, as I felt myself being pulled apart, piece by piece, I understood the true horror of what I had unleashed. The door had been a gateway, not just to a room, but to a different realm, a place where the laws of reality didn't apply, where the very fabric of existence was twisted and broken. The figures, the darkness, the light, they were all part of this place, this nightmare that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door, to step inside. And now, as I was being torn apart by the light, I knew that there was no escape. The door had been opened, and it would never close again. The darkness, the light, the horrors that they held, they were free now, and they would spread, consuming everything in their path, just as they were consuming me. In my final moments, as the last remnants of my consciousness were swallowed by the light, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear, the terror, the despair, they were all gone now, replaced by a cold, empty void. I had become part of the darkness, part of the light, part of the nightmare that I had unleashed. And then, there was nothing. In the aftermath of the light's overwhelming assault, I found myself in a place that defied all logic, a place that existed outside of time and space. The apartment, the door, even the darkness and the light, they were all gone, replaced by a vast, empty void that stretched out in every direction. There was no up or down, no left or right, just an endless expanse of nothingness, an abyss that seemed to swallow all sound, all light, all life. I was alone, utterly and completely, floating in the void with no sense of direction, no way to escape. But the terror was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. It was a cold, creeping fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering dark thoughts and terrible truths that I could not ignore. I could feel it in the very air around me, a malevolent presence that watched and waited, biding its time, knowing that I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The void was its domain, and I was nothing more than a trespasser, an intruder who had dared to venture into a place I did not belong. As I drifted through the abyss, I became aware of a new sensation, a pull that seemed to come from deep within the void itself. It was a gentle tug at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with each passing moment, drawing me toward something that I could not see but could feel in the pit of my stomach. It was a presence, dark and terrible, a force that I instinctively knew was the source of all the horrors I had faced. And it was calling to me, summoning me to its side. The pull became impossible to resist, dragging me through the void at an ever-increasing speed. The terror in my heart grew with it, a cold, suffocating dread that left me gasping for breath. I tried to fight it, to claw my way back to the safety of the darkness. But it was futile. The void was all-encompassing, its grip on me unbreakable. and I was powerless to stop it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pull stopped. I found myself standing on solid ground, though the void still surrounded me on all sides. The darkness here was different, thicker, more oppressive, as if it were alive and breathing, pulsating with a life of its own. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could sense the presence that had drawn me here, lurking just out of sight, watching me with eyes that I could not see, but could feel boring into my soul. The ground beneath me was cold and wet, slick with a substance that clung to my shoes, making each step a struggle. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a putrid smell that filled my lungs and left a bitter taste in my mouth. I tried to move, but the ground seemed to resist, as if it were trying to hold me in place, to keep me from fleeing. The void around me began to close in, the darkness pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. And then I saw it, the source of the pull, the presence that had drawn me into the void. It was a figure, barely discernible in the darkness, but unmistakable in its malevolence. It stood tall and thin, its body twisted and deformed, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch on forever. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque, contorted mass of flesh with hollow eyes that glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with sharp, jagged teeth that dripped with a dark, viscous liquid. It was a creature born of the void, a being of pure darkness and despair, and it had been waiting for me. The creature moved toward me with a slow, deliberate grace, its movements almost hypnotic in their fluidity. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, trapped by the creature's gaze, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, drawing me deeper into its terrible, unending void. I could feel its presence inside my mind, probing my thoughts, my memories, searching for something that I couldn't understand. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the void, shaking me to my very core. The words were incomprehensible, a language that I had never heard before, yet somehow I understood. It was speaking of the void, of the darkness that had consumed it, and of the light that had been extinguished long ago. It told me of the beings that had once inhabited this place, beings of unimaginable power and knowledge, who had been driven mad by the very forces they had sought to control. They had become twisted, deformed, just like the creature before me, their minds shattered by the darkness, their souls corrupted by the void. And now, the creature said, I was one of them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, the horror of it almost too much to bear. I was no longer human, no longer the person I had once been. The void had changed me, twisted me, just as it had twisted the beings that had come before me. I was part of the void now, a creature of darkness and despair, bound to the abyss for all eternity. The creature reached out to me, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of cold, electric terror through my body. I could feel its power, its overwhelming presence as it began to merge with me, to pull me deeper into the void, to make me one with it. My mind screamed in protest, my soul recoiling from the darkness, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The void was all-encompassing, all-consuming, and it was taking me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. As the creature pulled me into the void, I felt my memories slipping away, my thoughts dissolving into the darkness. I could no longer remember who I was, where I had come from, or why I had opened the door in the first place. All that remained was the void, the darkness, and the creature that had become part of me, just as I had become part of it. And then, just as I was about to be consumed completely, I heard something, a faint, distant sound, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was a voice, a human voice, calling out to me from the darkness, cutting through the void like a knife. It was a voice I recognized, though I couldn't place it. A voice filled with hope, with light. For a moment, the void seemed to recoil, the darkness retreating slightly, as if it were afraid of the voice. The creature stopped, its hollow eyes narrowing in confusion, as if it, too, had heard the voice and was trying to understand what it meant. I felt a surge of strength, of determination, as the voice grew louder, clearer, filling the void with its presence. The creature hissed, its grip on me tightening as it tried to drag me back into the darkness. But the voice would not be silenced. It called to me, urging me to fight, to resist, to hold on to the last remnants of my humanity, of my soul. I could feel the void weakening, the darkness retreating, as the voice grew stronger, filling me with a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. And then, with one final desperate effort, I broke free. The creature screamed in rage, its voice a cacophony of hatred and despair. As I tore myself away from its grasp, pulling myself out of the void, out of the darkness, the light returned, blinding and overwhelming. But this time it wasn't the destructive force that it had been before. It was warm, comforting, and it enveloped me, pulling me away from the void, away from the creature, away from the nightmare that had consumed me. I felt myself being lifted, carried away by the light, back to the world I had left behind. The void was still there, lurking at the edges of my vision, but it was no longer all-consuming. The darkness had been pushed back, the creature banished to the shadows, and I was free. Free to return to the world of the living. But as I emerged from the void, back into the apartment, I knew that I would never be the same. The darkness had touched me, changed me, and though I had escaped, a part of it remained, with me, a shadow that would never fully leave. The door was still there, still locked, still hiding its terrible secrets, and I knew that one day, someone else would find it. Someone else would open it, and the nightmare would begin again. The abyss had not been defeated. It had merely retreated, waiting for its next victim, its next soul to consume. And as I left the apartment, the memory of the void still fresh in my mind, I knew that the terror was far from over. The darkness was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed once more. The terror that had consumed me, that had nearly devoured my soul in the void, did not fade away as I stepped out of the apartment and into the world beyond. Instead, it clung to me like a second skin, a shadow that followed me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced and the dark secrets I had uncovered. But as much as I wanted to believe that I had escaped, that I had left the nightmare behind, a gnawing doubt began to take root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. I moved to a new city, a fresh start in a place where no one knew me, where I could try to rebuild my life. The apartment, the void, the creature, they were all behind me now, locked away in the recesses of my mind, or so I tried to convince myself. But the memory of the door, of what lay behind it, haunted my every waking moment. I could still feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, a dark weight pressing down on me, a constant, oppressive reminder that the nightmare was far from over. My new apartment was bright and modern, a stark contrast to the old decrepit building I had left behind. The walls were clean, the windows large and filled with sunlight, and the air was fresh, untainted by the stench of decay. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that this place was different, that it was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, a faint sense of unease that grew stronger the longer I stayed. I would catch myself glancing at the doors, expecting to see the symbols, the marks that had burned themselves into my mind, but there were none. The walls were clean, the doors ordinary, and yet the fear remained. Nights were the worst. In the darkness, the memories would come flooding back, vivid and terrifying, as if I were still trapped in that cursed apartment. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that the door was just down the hall, waiting for me to open it again. I would sit up in bed, straining to listen, half expecting to hear the whispers, the soft creak of the floorboards, the rustle of something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. But the apartment was silent, still, as if the very walls were holding their breath, and yet the terror would not let me go. It was in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and grow longer as the night went on, the way the air would turn cold for no apparent reason, the way I would sometimes hear faint, almost imperceptible sounds, footsteps, whispers, the creak of a door opening somewhere in the building only to find nothing there when I investigated. I began to doubt myself, to question my sanity. Was it all in my head, a lingering effect of the trauma I had endured? Or was the darkness still with me, following me, waiting for the right moment to strike? The people around me noticed the change. Friends, co-workers, they all began to comment on how distant I seemed, how tired, how distracted. I tried to brush it off, to reassure them that I was fine, but the truth was that I felt anything but. The terror had seeped into every aspect of my life, coloring everything I did, every thought, every action. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt it again, that pull, that same insidious force that had drawn me to the door in the first place. It was weaker now, more subtle, but it was there, a faint tug at the edges of my mind, a whisper in the darkness that I couldn't ignore. It called to me, urging me to find it, to open it once more. But there was no door here, no symbols, no void, and yet the fear remained, growing stronger with each passing second. I got out of bed, unable to stay still any longer. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing softly in the silence. Everything was as it should be, normal, ordinary. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I found myself standing in front of a door, just an ordinary door that led to a closet. But as I stood there, staring at it, the fear began to build, a cold, creeping dread that wrapped itself around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the handle. It was cold, almost icy to the touch, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt a surge of terror so intense that it nearly brought me to my knees. I knew, deep down, that there was nothing behind this door, nothing that could hurt me. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to open it. The memories of the void, of the creature, of the darkness that had consumed me, they were all too fresh, too vivid. And I knew that if I opened this door, I might find myself back in that nightmare, trapped once more, with no way out. I pulled my hand away, stepping back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but I forced myself to turn away, to walk back to my bed. But as I lay down, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. The days blurred into one another, each one filled with that same unshakable sense of dread. The pull was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that the nightmare was far from over. I began to lose track of time, of days and nights, of what was real and what was just a figment of my imagination. The fear was all-consuming, a constant gnawing presence that I couldn't escape. And then one day, it happened. I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with a book when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like the sound of a door opening somewhere in the apartment. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, listening, straining to hear. The apartment was silent, but the fear began to build, a cold, creeping dread that wrapped itself around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. I stood up, the book falling to the floor, forgotten. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamps outside. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing softly in the silence. Everything was as it should be, normal, ordinary. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I found myself standing in front of that same door, the one that led to the closet. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but I forced myself to reach out, to touch the handle. It was cold, almost icy to the touch, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt a surge of terror so intense that it nearly brought me to my knees. I knew, deep down, that there was nothing behind this door, nothing that could hurt me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to open it. The memories of the void, of the creature, of the darkness that had consumed me, they were all too fresh, too vivid. And I knew that if I opened this door, I might find myself back in that nightmare, trapped once more, with no way out. I pulled my hand away, stepping back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but I forced myself to turn away, to walk back to my bed. But as I lay down, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. And then the whispers began again. They were faint at first, just a soft murmur in the back of my mind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They spoke of the void, of the darkness that still lurked within me, waiting to be unleashed. They told me that the door was still there, still waiting, still hiding its terrible secrets. And they urged me to open it, to confront the darkness once more, to embrace the terror that I had tried so hard to escape. I tried to resist, to push the whispers away, but they were too strong. They filled my mind, my thoughts, my dreams, until I couldn't tell where they ended, and I began. The pull was stronger now, more insistent, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before I gave in, before I opened the door and faced whatever horrors lay in wait. But the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, and I couldn't bring myself to take that final step. The door remained closed, the mystery unsolved, the darkness still lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers filling my mind, I knew that the terror was far from over. The door was still there, still locked, still hiding its terrible secrets. And one day I knew I would have no choice but to open it, to confront the darkness once more, to face the horrors that awaited me on the other side.